Well, I held out for as long as I possibly could and just poured my first glass before your message came in. So, depending on how long we're chatting here, you'll have me for a time in a semi alert state, and you'll get to witness it degrade, and I will see how it goes.
Well, I think that makes for good audio.
Well, I'm not so sure, but if you think so, I'm willing to go along.
Well, I think if there's an underlying sort of character arc, if there are real world happenings that impinge upon the uh, the discourse, it can give a kind of narrative thread for certain kinds of people to hold on to. And so, one character degenerating into drunkenness, gives a kind of episodic feel.
Say, your connection is breaking up, and it was even a minute ago when we were talking. Is there any way at all to improve it?
Oh, well, I could try going to a different area of the house, potentially. Let me see if I can reconfigure the situation here, and then see how good our reception is. If you give me a moment.
Sure, take your time.
Can you hear me now?
Well, for the moment, I'll keep an eye on the signal, and with luck, things will hold out.
Terrific. Did you get a chance to listen to much of that material I recommended?
Yeah, probably all of it, I think. I listened to the round table chats on the Buddhist Geeks or Buddha Geeks podcast. I listened to a lecture given by this fellow Ingram himself. I listened to all sorts of stuff recently.
What do you make of all that?
Well, I appreciate and approve of the fact that Ingram seems to be talking about something as if it's a living thing and not just some sort of imaginary construct that comes from memorizing doctrine.
Yeah, I think one of the key things, and perhaps one of the most audacious things, is that Ingram is being straightforward about his claim to being an arhat, to be actually being enlightened, but not doing that in a way where he's seeking followers or donations, but saying look, this is just something that anyone can do. At the time when the Buddhist Sangha was originally founded, an awful lot of people did it. An awful lot of people still do it today, but because of various cultural strictures, don't talk about their realizations or attainments. And his general attitude that, if we were more straightforward about all this stuff, a lot more people would be able to get the same results, because not only would they see that it's possible, but they'd see that there's a straightforward and pragmatic way of going about these things.
Well, I think it's amusing and certainly it's symptomatic that they have to constantly have recourse to this idea of practical Buddhism when really what's at stake is actual Buddhism, it seems to me. So, in line with what you've said, if any of these, terms in the Buddhist discourse actually have reference outside of just the language games themselves. I mean, if any kind of experience actually takes place, if there's any kind of actuality, then yes, these sorts of attainments and experiences should be accessible to all those who apply themselves, at least if you, believe the doctrines themselves.
Sure thing. I mean, I think that there's a cultural divide that happened as Buddhism migrated to the West, there have effectively been two main currents of it. There's, cultural Buddhists, people who are usually of Asiatic origin, who have a more religious, perhaps dogmatic and ritually oriented relationship to the tradition as it's passed down in their own native culture. And then you have sort of convert Buddhism from people who are generally not of Asiatic racial origin. And the later of which tends to be more oriented toward practice, toward personal transformation, and the later of which, pretty much emerged as a boomer phenomena, began as something that was counterculturally fringe, the province of the hippie generation, and now has moved on to be something that's increasingly mainstream in a somewhat diluted way. I was reading recently that in 1983, there had only been 3 clinical studies of the effects of meditation practice. In 2013, there had been over 1,300 of them. And, now people are attending meditation workshops in corporate environments and healthcare environments, and so on. And so meditation itself is, getting a lot of good press and a lot of scientific validation. And while that is a good thing, there's also something lost, because the way that meditation is usually talked about in those contexts is as a means of stress reduction, as a means of increasing personal efficacy in the workplace, as a means of dealing with one's mundane problems, and so on. But in fact, the tradition as a whole is aimed at something more ambitious than that. The tradition as a whole is aimed at enlightenment as a means to be of service, at least in the Mahayana, to all sentient beings. And so the way that it's sort of, on the one hand, it's a good thing, broader audience. On the other hand, a lot that could be real and valuable, like enlightenment itself, like karma, like rebirth, is left by the roadside because science is interested in what it can get from the tradition, but it's not interested in being mutually interrogated by the tradition.
Well, that's a good way of putting it. I've observed the same thing, so I concur with what you're saying. And, it's the usual clusterfuck, really. Anytime you have a kind of cultural exchange, to use a phrase, this sort of thing happens. I mean, it's not enough to even call that a double-edged sword. The fact that, on the one hand, there are a lot of people who can benefit from the sheer practice of meditation, and on the other hand, that doing so in a kind of environment, for example, a corporate environment, where all it is meant to be is a palliative for the imbalances and the stresses and the negative effects that come with the horrible situation, the horribly unnatural situation they find themselves, namely the corporate one. So, yeah, sure, it's a double-edged sword, but I mean, if you can have a triple-edged sword or a quadruple-edged sword, all around, it's a bit of a mess. I sign on as well with your distinction between the Buddhism in which probably most of the world's Buddhists participate, namely organic Buddhism, something that's been around for centuries. It's organic to the cultural environment, so on and so forth, and this more recent countercultural Western Buddhism. It's probably no surprise that in these Protestant countries, with the emphasis on practicality and work ethic and so on, that number one, you had the countercultural discovery of Buddhism, and number two, that now it's being used to perform these sort of very stripped down, near-term, localized benefits. And of course, the point you make about science is also a good one. Science is not at all interested in having itself doubted by something like a Buddhist perspective. It simply wants to submit Buddhism to the usual reductionism, to dissect it, to determine its effects and its limits and so on. But we're witnessing it now unfold. We'll see. We're in the sort of beginning to middle stages of this confrontation between the two.
It'll be interesting because, I mean, whenever Buddhism transits to a new culture, it has a tendency to merge with something that already exists, in contrast to Christianity, which by and large has, dominated and then extinguished the existing cultural frameworks, sometimes appropriating things like holidays or sort of symbolic motifs or aesthetic gestures or stuff, but by and large, dominating and extinguishing. Buddhism, on the other hand, when it entered China, it merged with indigenous Taoism and became Chan, which was later, repronounced in Japanese as Zen. When it entered Tibet, it merged with the indigenous Bon shamanic tradition and then formed the sort of unusual mixture of ritualistic and highly symbolic and shamanic flavored practice that is now Tibetan Buddhism, and so on. And as it comes here, it seems like it's simultaneously hitting up against a few different cultures. It's hitting up against, on the one hand, the New Age culture, and many of the terms of art in Buddhism have, fully permeated the New Age, and it's simultaneously hitting up against the cultures of cognitive science and psychoanalysis. And so there's at least a twofold merger going on in our own culture.
It would be nice, in my opinion, if both Buddhism and science could be interrogated from some other more useful perspective. Because Buddhism, the way I see it, at least at this exact moment, to mention another double-edged sword, in this sort of mixing between traditional Buddhism and the Buddhism now in these largely Protestant countries. On the one hand, you have the weight of tradition, which I think is something that people in Western countries who would be Buddhists, they inevitably have to confront. And that is, if you're interested in going beyond at all meditation as, quote unquote, mindfulness as a kind of mental exercise, and into something like Buddhism, you end up really having to confront the weight of these centuries of practiced tradition. So on the one hand, I think it forces people who did not grow up in a kind of culture where Buddhism was organic and pervasive, it forces them to step outside of themselves and Buddhism in that case, when they confront the centuries of tradition, cannot simply be just an artifact of their imaginations. On the other hand, I think that the fact that Buddhism, like any other tradition, set of traditions, religion, is ossified and has taken a lot of distortion into itself and made the distortion as permanent as it possibly can, for all the usual reasons, problems of transmission, problems of translation, so on and so forth. And that's why I think it would be nice if Buddhism itself could be interrogated from some sort of vantage point that was not just current day Western science, which really has nothing to offer it. It would be nice to kind of excavate as much as possible what's viable in all of these generations and centuries of traditional practice. Of course, it's a slippery slope because someone like a physical scientist would claim to want to do the same thing. Oh, well, we want to take what's essential and practical out of it and, ignore all the rest, throw away the superstitious nonsense and so on. I'm not really advocating that. So it's a kind of third way or fourth way that doesn't seem to be of interest to any particularly large group of people at the moment.
Well, I think that's due in large measure to the fact that philosophy proper, philosophy qua philosophy, isn't really of interest to any particularly large group of people. Philosophy, to paraphrase Richard Rorty, professional, academic philosophy is somewhat incomprehensible to people in the same way that modern art is incomprehensible to people. When people look at a piece of modern art, there's a sense of incomprehension and helplessness because they have no way of judging whether a particular piece is good of its kind, and they have really no way of adjudicating even why anyone would want such a thing. Because art is part of a process of responding to other art and experimenting with existing motifs, and it takes place within a certain bounded cultural terrain. And in like manner, philosophy, if you're not keeping up on the whole dialogue, seems to have a kind of queer irrelevance, because these people are mainly talking to themselves, to one another, because the amount of literature that one needs in order to keep up with what's happening in the field, extends all the way back to Thales, and without having a sense of what people really feel can and can't be said, and what is a tenable means of knowing, what counts as a valid criteria of truth, what counts as a valid criteria of inference, what counts as a legitimate question. The whole thing can seem to an outsider like a racket, in the way that art can seem like a racket. And there's this dual expectation placed upon the philosopher by the general sort of non-professional literate reader. On the one hand, we expect philosophers to be like technicians. We expect them to have consensus about aims and methods, like a scientist. On the other hand, we expect them to be like artists, in as much as we expect, the occasional extraordinary vision embodied in the work of some great thinker. And so that tension between the role of philosophy as art and the role of philosophy as science puts it in a very peculiar place that makes it strangely inaccessible, because there is no one who's immune to philosophical questions, and there's no one who doesn't feel like their own personal latest of presuppositions that constitutes their personal philosophy isn't true. So there's no one who doesn't deem it important, and yet almost no one participates in it. And philosophy, I think, is that third member of the triad which could arbitrate a discussion like this interaction between Buddhism and science. Philosophy, at least since Kant, has seen itself as the tribunal that adjudicates claims to truth in art and ethics and politics and religion. And it's a role that it can still play because of the field's sensitivity to the kinds of issues that are in play here, and the kind of things that might be naively presupposed, for example, by science, uh, in terms of the objective existence of the material world, or by Buddhism, perhaps, in certain cases, in as much as the idea that, phenomenal reality is simply given, just to pull random examples. So it seems like there's a place for philosophy in this, and it's, you know, largely absent from the dialogue that we're talking about.
Well, that's why I've been interested lately in early Buddhism, because it seems to me that what you have said there about the process that sort of captures philosophy and art and so on in the 20th century, it's a process that, I mean, it happens to all sorts of things in all sorts of places, and not just philosophy, not just art, without trying to break down the mechanism too precisely. I can think of another example, which would be something like jazz music in the 20th century. Jazz music was, for a time, maybe a period of about 20 or 30 years, a kind of wild eruption out of everyday life, whether it was the sort of music of the 1920s with the Bix Beiderbecke, and then in the 30s, at the end of which you sort of began the swing era, and then so on. But by the 50s, it was clear that the music had started to die for a variety of reasons, and that was really because, in my opinion, it started to become self-reflexive. That is, for a couple of decades, they had this wild burst of creativity, and the music was sophisticated, and it was really on par in terms of its grammar and vocabulary with what is usually grouped together under the term classical music. Once people started to sort of catch on to that, in the late 40s, you had the development of the jazz critic, the jazz music critic. So you had all of these discourses arise, all of these efforts, pretty authoritarian and always mean-spirited efforts at bottom, to say, this is jazz, this is not jazz, this is real jazz, this isn't. It's the typical gesture of the critic. And not coincidentally, at the same time, musicians seeking to distinguish themselves from, older musicians started to change and innovate in directions that were more self-reflexive as well. So the whole bebop movement at the end of the 40s with Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker and so on, they stopped playing music for the masses, and they started playing music for themselves. And this was a process that went on for another 10 or 20 years, but really it was the beginning of the end of jazz, because it no longer attracted mainstream interest. And of course, the elitist response to that is always to say, oh, well, that's because the common people are stupid. But another way of saying that is to say that it no longer reflected everyday experience. It was no longer music that arose out of everyday experience. Instead of it being jazz music which came out of, bar rooms in New Orleans with dirt floors, which is as close to the common people as you can get, now it was music for other musicians. Who were the people who went to the clubs, at 3 a.m. to hear Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker play? Other musicians. So it was self-reflexive in that way. And the whole history of jazz from the 50s, maybe through 1970, you can see this sort of detail appear again and again and again. When Miles Davis turned his back on the audience while he was playing, this was a giant scandal decades ago. Today it means nothing. But there again, you have another little gesture where The music was for him and his fellow musicians in the audience. They could, tag along if they wanted to or not. Fuck them. So I think it's a similar process, whether it's philosophy becoming academic or art becoming modern, music and so on. And to some extent, I think you see it throughout history in any case. When religious traditions, pile commentary on commentary on commentary, which is often said to be the case in Buddhism, and these commentaries become more and more obscure and longer, and clearly they're intended for a smaller and smaller group of people to understand, namely others who are able to write and understand commentaries. You see the same type of thing. So early Buddhism is of interest to my mind because that process has not taken hold to such an extent. So there might be some sort of living experience which is of interest to anybody who's interested in human experience in general.
I think that early Buddhism definitely does have, a lot of the virtues that you suggest. But I think that there's also authentic growth and authentic deepening of understanding in certain philosophical and practical strains. I think that the common narrative that you hear in the spiritual counterculture nowadays is, the original teacher is authentic, and at some point along the way, the exoteric expositors of their authentic visionary experience turned it into something which is a means of conformity and control. And while there is that element in the history of Buddhism, as much as in any other belief system, there is also a sort of living, vibrant tradition where philosophical and practical progress is made. If you read Nagarjuna, there's a philosophical leap forward, which is undeniable. And if you read Tsongkhapa, there's a similar philosophical leap forward, which is undeniable. Now, the funny thing is that, in Western philosophy, the tendency is for great figures to say, read me and ignore my predecessors, because it is here, either with clear and distinct ideas, or with the eidetic reduction, or whatever. It is here that we have placed philosophy on the short path of a science, and from this point forward, we'll be able to make a start, to have overcome the problem of the presupposition. In Buddhist philosophy, on the other hand, there's the opposite sort of claim. The claim is I'm not really saying anything new. All of the sort of philosophical refinements that are being made are already implicit in the original texts. But the thing is that authentic expansion of understanding is something that's sort of it's hard to get a hold of, because all this is relatively obscure. The material that's written for the average reader doesn't really touch on that, But there's more and more stuff coming out that has more sophistication, in which you can glean sort of thing. And it's not only philosophical refinement; it's practical refinement. The whole text, the commentarial text that forms the basis of everything that Ingram's talking about and writing about, the Visuddhimagga, and the Vimudhimagga, they rose considerably late, a good deal after the composition of the sutras. And yet, that systematization of the material in the sutras is really, really useful, because there's all kinds of linguistic distinctions that aren't made in the sutras. For instance, they use the word jhana to refer to concentrative absorption as they do to refer to insight. And there's this implicit distinction that's never really made between what sense in which they're using the word and stuff like that. So, you know, I think uh, it's just the overall thrust of what I'm saying is a cautionary point uh, that a good deal of value could be lost focusing exclusively on the early tradition.
Well, that's no doubt true. At the same time, the early tradition itself seems to me, based on my very cursory examination of the scholarship, to be so obscure that focusing on the early tradition presently can only be of benefit. And certainly later on, things can be retrieved from these great leaps forward that you describe. But a number of different articles that I've seen online and journal articles that I've managed to download suggest that there was something very unpretentious and relatively clear happening in the beginning stages of Buddhism, and it became increasingly obscure, and the obscurity became celebrated and institutionalized. And at least for someone like me who is not interested in mastering the entire Buddhist corpus, if I had to choose a place to focus, I would rather focus on what may be visible from the early stages rather than, much, much later. And it's the same with Christianity as well, the study of early Christianity, not necessarily because of any kind of insights into the world or the human condition, but in terms of understanding the history of its development, its origins, and so on. That's also kind of where I'm coming from personally. Um, the past few weeks, at any rate.
Yeah, it's a similar situation to Western philosophy because really a lot of subsequent development is prefigured in Plato. So much of what is possible in epistemology foreshadowed in the Theaetetus, for example. And you flip through Plato, and you really find, to an astonishing degree, that it's really all there. It's not fully hashed out. It's not worked out in its entirety, but the agenda is set, and many of, if not all, of the critical questions are at least posed. And so it's certainly true that there's sort of organic eruption of spontaneous human activity represented in those dialogues. And yet, of course, it would be impossible to doubt, that something fundamentally new is represented in, Descartes, Kant, Hume, Wittgenstein, etc. Even though, in another sense, it's all there in the origin. So I think it's as good a place as any to start. And there's an enormous wealth of material right there in the beginning.
Well, just a few days ago, I had a lot that I wanted to say and to discuss about Buddhism and the things I've been reading and so on. And unfortunately, the moment has sort of passed. I'm not prepared at the moment to unpack a lot of the ideas and, unfortunately, potentially very stimulating dialogue that could have resulted from it. But my interest in it hasn't died on the vine, So I'll continue to look into it. But I mean, the points you make are valid, and there is a lot to be said for what you mentioned about Plato, and I think that's frequently the case. I think that in the beginning, whatever combination of experience produces the questions and the insights, the problems, the difficulties, and so on, it's most visible in the beginning. It doesn't mean that it's all accurate. I think it would be obviously a mistake to go looking for example, the words of the Buddha in order to find literal, actual truth, in the same way that looking for the original words of Jesus, I mean, on the one hand, it's of interest because it's more substantive, it seems to me. But that isn't to say that it's necessarily accurate in its reflecting of the world. So rather than a Christian fundamentalist, going to heroic lengths to uncover the original words of Jesus, it's more of interest to say, well, if there was some sort of authentic lived experience that produced these insights and this whole set of problematics, it's best to get close to that. And certainly there are always developments later on, and latter-day figures who, possessed of intellect, will offer innovation. But I agree with you. I think if you're going to choose a place, that would be a place to start. Start with as close to the beginning as you can get.
I think the modern period is also pretty good for getting a grasp of it, because there are all kinds of great figures like who can give a good lens into the history, and into what's relevant and what's still alive in the conversation today. Ingram is really great in as much as, he gives a clear, unambiguous exploration of the maps of meditative development that developed in Southeast Asian Theravada. And that if one were to try reading the Visuddhimagga before listening to him and looking through his book, it would appear hopelessly obscure. But he's a good modern place that casts a light back on the past. And I think Alan Wallace is similarly important, because he lived for a long time in Dharamsala, in exile, and in the mountains of India and Nepal, and then later in Southeast Asia, and practiced very seriously, not only in a Tibetan Mahayana context, but in a Theravadan context as well. And then, this still didn't feel satisfied with truth, and so came back to America and, got advanced degrees in the philosophy of science and comparative religion. And his stuff, I think, illuminates a lot of what's valuable in the philosophical tradition, because it's presented in dialogue with the central problematics of the Western philosophical tradition and the central problematics of the philosophy of science. Go from all the way back from Copernicus to, Wheeler and Hawking. And so I think the two of them, as a starting point, can sort of shine a light into the past and show an agenda for a curious, philosophically inclined intellectual to be able to say, okay, well, these are where the highlights are, and this is what has relevance to the Western tradition and to science.
Well, I find of particular interest the Buddhism of Bhutan, with the giant dicks painted on the sides of the buildings. I don't know if you're familiar, if you've encountered the articles online about Bhutan. Did you know that they have phalli on the corners of the rooftops as good luck charms?
No, I didn't know about that.
Well, there's a person who I knew sort of as an acquaintance who's a Buddhist, and she recommended to me a historical figure, and I really don't think I could pronounce the name or even spell it. But Drupka Kunli was a figure who purportedly spent most of his time drunk. They call him the saint of 5,000 women. Women were said to seek his blessing in the form of sex. And let's see, according to that very reliable source, Wikipedia, it says Kundalini's penis is referred to as the thunderbolt of flaming wisdom. And for this reason, women from all around the world visit his monastery to seek his blessing. Now, apart from the obvious reason why this guy has to be fantastic, you know, there's this category of crazy wisdom.
Yes.
Seems to have a place in Buddhism. And of course, I find myself drawn to that as well. But it's one of these elements that, like in so many traditions, it's within the tradition, and yet it doesn't seem to be effectively incorporated into the tradition at the same time. It's just sort of, you know, the crazy uncle who's sitting there at, you know, Christmas time who no one's talking to. I wonder if you have any light to shed on that.
Well, the crazy wisdom tradition is very important, and it's very much in evidence in the 84 Mahasiddhas. A siddha is someone who has supernormal powers, and so someone who possesses those powers is known as a siddha. A siddhi is a supernormal power, and someone who possesses them is a siddha. A mahasiddha is, you know, a great possessor of such abilities. And the 84 Mahasiddhas are sort of founding hagiographic figures in the Tibetan tradition. And the entire Vajrayana lineage is thoroughly infused with the flavor of their teachings. The thing is that, and a good example of contemporary Mahasiddha is the late Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who is the founder of Shambhala. And Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, he was a completely wild character. You know, he once found that one of his students wasn't being completely mindful in their practice and in their daily life. And that student was his personal attendant, because later in life he was seriously disabled because he had crashed his car into a joke shop full of rubber chickens and such like. And so while his attendant wasn't paying attention, he deliberately threw himself down the stairs to injure himself further, to teach him a lesson about mindfulness. And that was the sort of thing that he would do. He was wild and crazy, and he would show up to his talks completely drunk beyond imagination. I once asked a student of his whether the stair thing was true, and I believe it was the father of one of my teachers. This guy's name, the student of Trungpa's name is David Nickturn. And he said, well, I didn't know about that one, but that was pretty much Trungpa Rinpoche's whole life, throwing himself down the stairs for his students. And so he's a good sort of contemporary person to look at in that vein. Let me think. You know, the thing is about crazy wisdom is that it's dangerous. You know, there's dual potentiality of potential self-harm when you're practicing, because there are two poles that you can lean toward. On the one hand, you can lean toward renunciation and simply avoid mental affliction, simply avoid apparent vice. But the danger in that is being sort of puritanical and being sort of self-righteous. On the other hand, there's the opposite pole in practice, which is transmutation. But if you lean toward transmutation, you can just justify drunkenness and womanizing and slovenliness and say, well, you know, it's all just my participation in the uncontrived, clear light of the mind and the infinite, unconditioned purity of all things, when in fact, you're just being an asshole. And so, for that reason, the later path of transmutation is something that's usually taught and explained after someone has a good amount of foundation, so they don't just go spinning off um, into wretchedness.
Well, I suppose it's a matter of taste. What it does make me think of is something that's been on my mind recently, and that is the sort of discovery that there is no hard and fast division between Buddhism and so-called Eastern philosophy and the West. Learning historically, for example, that the robes that you typically identify with Buddhist monks are in fact Greek togas, if Wikipedia is to be believed. It's extraordinary. And in the opposite direction, seeing the obvious debt owed to Buddhism and to India by the earliest Greek philosophers, it no longer seems to me valid to speak of Western cultural civilization. You might as well change your term over to Indo-European and include India and Buddhism, because there was far too much cross-contamination in the few centuries leading up to the time of so-called Christ, um, realizing that Buddhist monks were sent out to evangelize. They were sent out as missionaries all over the Mediterranean, that there was a Buddhist colony in Alexandria, Egypt, in the centuries leading up to the Christian period. The fact that Christianity itself seems to have this great unacknowledged debt to Buddhism. Not only are the motifs in the story of Jesus similar to those in the story of Buddha, but you have a lot of features in Christianity that can't possibly come from Judaism. I mean, you don't have monks and nuns in Judaism. The idea of disciples. People online have formed lists that are far more comprehensive than anything I can call to mind at the moment. But the very superstructure of what we now take to be Christianity may well have come from a Buddhist / Indian cultural milieu, because it could have come from nowhere else.
Sure. Geshe Michael Roach has a book on the subject, which he calls, I believe it's called The Eastern Path to Heaven, which, is informed by his dialogue with Christian theologians. And Michael Roach, he's an interesting figure. He's the first Westerner to attain the Geshe degree, which is pretty much a super PhD. It usually takes about 30 years to get in the Gelugpa monastic system. And it involves the memorization of vast and complicated treatises on logic and the theory of perception and so on. So he's an interesting guy, and he's written and lectured a good bit about this intersection with Christianity. And if you look at teaching like the Sermon on the Mount, it's very similar to a teaching in the Tibetan tradition known as Lojong. And in Lojong, you pretty much regard whatever person arises in your life as a manifestation of enlightenment, someone who is there to teach you. And every situation is to be regarded as a crucible for manifesting compassion. And maybe I can find these 7 verses of mind transformation, which are one of the most common and oft-quoted texts in the Lojong tradition. It says things to the effect of, you know, may I regard all sentient beings as a wish-fulfilling gem, and so always hold them dear. Uh, Whenever I interact with someone, may I view myself as the lowest, um, and hold the other as the highest. Uh,
Well,
and
didn't
so on.
Tibetan Buddhism sort of take root later? I could be entirely in the wrong, but was it around at the time of the supposed historical Jesus, or let's say in the following centuries in which the Sermon on the Mount might have been composed?
Now, Tibetan Buddhism definitely arose later, but it shows a similarity of attitude. You know, turn the other cheek, and praying only in the closet, and so on, are very much similar in their attitude. So it could suggest not that so much that Lojong inspired the Sermon on the Mount, or necessarily vice versa, but there's a common origin to both.
Well, that I don't doubt. Yeah, I can. I mean, that what strikes me is the very idea of asceticism. That really strikes me as something that is perhaps the most significant feature of what might have been a communication between Buddhist India and Greece and the Near East and so on. The idea that you might have these people who, in groups, set about depriving themselves of worldly possessions and food and so on and so forth. The the philosophers, the Greek philosophers who accompanied Alexander the Great into India, are said to have encountered these types, these gymnosophists, and not by chance, a few of them came back and started repeating doctrines that probably were very closely related to those with whom they communicated over there. And yet, that continues to echo down the centuries when you have cynics who reject human convention, worldly goods. They set themselves opposed to human society. They say that you have to return to the natural order of things. They leave the towns. They live in the countryside. They live off of, practically nothing. That's the same type of thing. So it seems to me that this idea, this kind of like social phenomenon of asceticism, until I see evidence otherwise, it seems like it originated in northwest India and so on, and was brought into Greece and the Near East and so on, probably with a lot of much more specifically Buddhist ideas as the centuries progressed, and a lot of these things informed and became Christianity, and no one today seems to realize it.
Sure. And I mean, the correspondences between, potential correspondences with Buddhism are replete in ancient Greek philosophy. Take, as an example, Heraclitus and his emphasis on impermanence, his emphasis on the sort of fluid and changing nature of reality. It's also worth noting two things. One, asceticism in India is older than Buddhism. The Buddha practiced self-mortification and self-denial before attaining to his own, unique and groundbreaking realizations. And he studied, altered states of consciousness with others, and a lot of the doctrines and practices which were later absorbed into Buddhism, existed already in the broadly Hindu sociocultural matrix. And secondly, it's worth noting that Buddhism itself is, to a great extent, a rejection of sheer renunciation. Because what the Buddha himself discovered was that when he was practicing, complete self-mortification and total asceticism, it wasn't possible to balance the mind in the way that was needed to get the level of insight that was being sought. And so the phrase the middle way, although it later also came to refer to the philosophical mediation between nihilism and eternalism, in the Buddha's own time referred to the balance between hedonism and asceticism. and not falling into to either extreme.
Yeah, I've been reading about that. The sort of the pre-existing cultural environment in which Buddhism probably emerged in the context of studies by people who at least are willing to doubt whether there was even a historical Buddha to begin with. It's interesting to see the exact same problems existing in the studies of Buddhism and the studies of Christianity in terms of the origins. There are, existing cultural environments where a lot of things are in play. There's a lot of synthesis going on between all sorts of regional ideas, and you've got a lot of political transformations going on with empires expanding the reach, and then fading away, and other empires coming in. So you have a lot of there's a lot in the mix, and I mean, what you say rings true with what I've been reading about the environment that was already in place before what became Buddhism appeared. With, for example, Jainism, I understand that they've lost their original texts altogether, and that they even admit it. And with the, well, a lot of other details as well.
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely fascinating to see how all these things sort of synthesize and diverge. I think it's also worth pointing out that the recurrence of these ideas isn't necessarily just due to cultural diffusion. It could also just be due to the potentialities of mind and to experimentation. Because there's that phrase coined by Leibniz, philosophia perennis, the perennial philosophy. You find recurrences of the same sort of mystical motifs in cultures that don't have such a strong historical connection as India and the Mediterranean. You find it all over the place, sort of a broad structural similarity in both the means by which altered states are attained, the significance given to them, what the real, mystical, esoteric side of these religions holds to be the ultimate nature of reality, and the ultimate nature of the mind, and the self's relationship with it, and so on. And so it could be more than just cultural diffusion that brings about these similarities. It could also be the fact that people are tapping into the same stream, as it were, and finding similar means to be conducive to tapping into that stream effectively.
Well, that's no doubt true. Unfortunately, I would say that that has been a refuge for scholars who traditionally have wanted to keep the areas of, well, let's say, Christianity and Buddhism distinct. You've had a lot of resistance over the decades to the idea that there could be quite so much communication. I mean, obviously the landmass is contiguous, and nonetheless, because you've got people who work in a Department of New Testament Studies, and you got people who work in the Department of Eastern Studies, or whatever you want to call it at a particular university, they therefore think that they must have been absolutely distinct. And even to this day, you find where there's a slight willingness to concede that there was communication between the domains, that, well, it was only under extraordinary circumstances. For example, on Wikipedia, you'll find it claimed that prior to Alexander the Great, moving east and conquering all sorts of territory, there was absolutely no communication between, India and the Near East. Well, that's probably not true. It's just a desire to keep our academic departments clean and distinct that we keep hoping that human cultural life doesn't have the same messiness as biological life. Populations migrate, they expand, they move in ways that are undeniable, And I would suspect that the diffusion of cultures, the interaction of cultures, and so on, has a similar capacity for flexibility. And so there's a reluctance to admit that sort of thing. But, I certainly agree with you. There's nothing that says that nothing new ever happens in history. If you have a capable mind applying itself to a problem or a situation that exists elsewhere, previously or at the same time, that capable mind may originate similar or even identical attempted solutions. But again, it's a mistake to say that one generality is supreme and another has no basis. There are cases where someone will independently come up with an idea or a philosophy in response to a kind of given situation, and there are other situations where they arise, out of a kind of existing cultural exchange of information. There's just a question of the preponderance of the evidence on a given point, what you choose as your explanation, I suppose.
Sure thing. And, I think that it's regrettable that people want to section off the purity of their own subject of study. I think it's due to some latent or overt desire for their area of expertise to be what uniquely pertains to reality. I think that a lot of people who study Christianity, for example, are to some extent or another Christians and would like to believe that Jesus Christ is the one true Son of God, and that they, need to preserve, therefore, the authenticity of their religious revelation.
Oh, it's been studied. I mean, there have been surveys done of New Testament scholars, scholars of sort of biblical archaeology and so on. It's been empirically determined that something on the order of like 90% or more of these scholars either are or have been in the past devout, even fundamentalist Christians. The guy who is the now the media darling, this Bart Ehrman character, who was really insufferable. But in the way that these academics try to become the major player by monopolizing the airwaves and getting all of the interviews and getting magazine articles, this Bart Ehrman character, Ehrman, is considered the heavyweight of New Testament biblical studies, biblical history, and so on. This guy was a Christian fundamentalist. And of course, later in life, he rejected all that and became a legitimate scholar. But there's always a certain boundary beyond which they will not travel. In his case, he wrote supposedly a series of excellent books on the New Testament criticism and so on. But when faced with the idea or the arguments that there was no historical Jesus at all, he came out with a book which supposedly is really just awful trash, in which he was totally ill-equipped to deal with the arguments. He misrepresented all of the arguments and so on. And on the one hand, you could say that this is his fundamentalist upbringing. You can reject your upbringing to a certain extent and say, I'm superior to it, I'm emancipated from it, rather than Jesus being the Son of God and being divine, I'm going to declare him to be a Hebrew prophet who was apocalyptic, and here's what his real ethics and philosophy were like, but he absolutely existed. And then, when you're hit from the outside with the idea, the thought that maybe there was no historical Jesus at all and a counter theory explaining why, the guy folded. And I think that's the case with most of them, so that's certainly so.
Well, I think that brings to mind one of the things that might be uniquely, one of the things that might account for uh, the philosophical pregnancy of wisdom traditions like Buddhism and the accuracy of its claims about the nature and the potentialities of mind. Because the sociocultural milieu in which Buddhism arose was a very pragmatic and experimental one. People were going around very much like in America in the 60s, seeking counsel from various spiritual teachers and employing their techniques and comparing notes as to what worked and what didn't. And later on, you can read in the hagiographies of figures like Aryadeva and Nagarjuna that there was an environment where if a person lost a debate, a religious debate, they would need to convert to the religion of the victorious interlocutor. And so, in an environment, contrast that environment with the West, for example, after the advent of Christianity, where you have mystics who claim, I've had a direct experience of the Godhead, and I've realized that, in my innermost being, where I'm at one with the non-dual transcendent, uh, my nature is no different from the nature of God. I am God, and you're God, and we're all God. And, those sorts of people would either be marginalized or killed. So I think, to a large extent, the difference between those two cultures can account for why we have so much accuracy and so much that is of use in Buddhism and also in other Eastern frameworks like Taoism or Advaita Vedanta. And it's because of the scientific method. And so you ask yourself, well, what constitutes science? Science basically just boils down to its methodology, not necessarily its current framework of belief and understanding, but the threefold strands of objective knowledge, which are, you have an injunction, you have direct apprehension, and you have falsification by a community of the injunction. This might be to, pour this blue liquid into a test tube at 100 degrees, turns green. The apprehension is that it turns green, and the falsification by the community of the adequate is when you submit your findings to other people who are literate in the properties of these substances and their combinatoric potentials, and they can say whether or not your experimental conditions were good or not. And it's the same thing with meditation. In India and Nepal and Tibet and in Southeast Asia, focus your mind, you know, allow thoughts to drop away, look at what arises. You should see eventually that there's no inherently existent self, and when you do so, it should diminish the possibility of mental affliction. And you do it, and then you submit your findings to a community of the adequate, and then you have this process of refinement and critique, which is parallel to science. And so that's something I think that is unique in the traditions that survive to the present.
Well, even granting what you say, I'm not sure that Buddhism should take a lot of credit for that. In a way, it's apples and oranges. You know, in what you said, giving the example of someone who experiences revelation and then experiencing, subsequent persecution, that's a very different sort of thing than um, experimental relationship to experience in general. When looking at Buddhism lately, in the past couple of weeks as I've done, I was really struck and floored by how non-theistic it really is when you get down to it. If you start to see past the Western caricatures of Buddhism and begin to see what may actually be there. God does not play a role in it, at least as far as I'm concerned. Now, Buddhism is a many-headed beast with all sorts of layers and offshoots, and it's a very complex object. So certainly there's some vantage point from which that could be disputed, but you're talking about two entirely different things. I fully agree that there's a kind of aggressiveness and persecution in Christianity that you don't see in many circumstances in Buddhism. But of course, that's not to say at the same time that Buddhism is without its own aggressiveness and internal disputes and conflicts and deaths and mayhem and so on. It's more what I would say is just an overall different configuration.
Sure. And that's not to say that, or to suggest that, it's without those problems. But what I'm saying is that there seems to be enough leeway for that kind of experimentation to take place. Not so much that it's something for which Buddhism can take credit, but that it's a cultural environment that allowed for these sorts of revelatory experiences to become systematized and rendered into something pragmatic and replicatable.
Well, in that respect, I mean, to the extent that it's trying to the extent that it's structured around an experience accessible to all, which, you could say is experience in general, to the extent that it's a body of doctrines and investigations that center around the issue of experience itself, then that's absolutely true. But at the same time, Christianity is not engaged in that. It's not, from my perspective at any rate, entirely valid to say that in Buddhism you're dealing with revelatory experiences because you're not talking about God or angels. Now, in Christianity, of course, that's the whole thing. But in Christianity also, they wanted to lay down the iron fist and say that this is the universal church. And yes, in the past, angels would visit the prophets and so on, but now that's done. We've established the doctrine. It's an eternal doctrine. It's going to exist for the ages. There's no experimentation because they're not talking about experience. Here's the Word of God in the old form, with the old covenant with Moses, and now this has been superseded by the new covenant, but with Jesus. But we have a kind of theological rationale for how the two sort of coincide. We can unite the two and so on. So, again, I mean, I'm not disputing the accuracy of what you're saying per se, but to compare the two, I mean, naturally, Buddhism is going to be more tolerant of differing opinions when, in its very makeup, we're talking about people who are submitting themselves to the investigation of experience and so on. And there's nothing like that at all going on in parallel in Christianity, as far as I can tell.
Until now, to a certain extent, because now we have the cultural interpenetration of Buddhism and very open-minded and mystically oriented Christians. And so you have the fact you have Christians and Jews and Muslims taking up meditation and mindfulness practice and integrating it into their own religious framework as a means of pursuing some form of gnosis or some form of even own personal emotional equilibrium or whatever the goal is. So
Well,
whether
that's
or
quite
not,
interesting. Have you seen evidence of that? I mean, are there actual practitioners of either Judaism or Christianity who are taking on these, practices and then, in an effort to open the doors to phenomena that they want to approach with their own religious perspective?
sure, yeah, there's a lot of that. I mean, there are churches that have meditation courses. There are, Shinjin Young talks about it in one of his Buddhist Geeks lectures. And, if you look around, you can see uh, a lot of stuff to that effect. There's a dialogue between Ken Wilber, who's more or less Buddhist in outlook, even though he's sort of a comparative, integral figure, and, Christian mystical theologian who, you know, is talking about having used these techniques of concentration and then experienced this or that. Um, it's out there. And then if you read the works of, contemporary, near contemporary Christian figures like Thomas Merton, who have like had encounters with Zen and other things, uh, the cross fertilization is.
Well, that's horrifying to me. I mean, it's one thing for someone like a Thomas Merton, who kind of, from an academic theological perspective, encounters the ideas, qua ideas, and so on. But if today there are, in fact, fundamentalist Christians, evangelical Christians, Jews, going into meditative practice in order to open the doors to phenomena, which they will then give religious interpretations according to their own personal religion. I mean, that's terrible.
Well, I think.
I'll give you an example of what I mean. I heard an interview just the other night with someone who was supposedly a psychic medium, and, a lot of what she said seemed credible. She wasn't delusional or lying, let's put it that way, but she insisted that she was able to perform exorcisms on account of the fact that, her spirit guides were like the Archangel Michael and the Archangel Gabriel. Now, I refuse to believe that there is, in fact, an Archangel Michael and an Archangel Gabriel. So what is she doing there? Now, it's a complex question, and I don't think it should be answered dismissively or simply. But for a start, I suspect she's overlaying her own, religiosity onto these phenomena. Maybe there are entities involved. Maybe it's her imagination in those particular cases. I don't know. But it seems like these religions that have been so drained of vitality and are just dead men walking at this point, if, Buddhist meditative practice is giving them a new vitality because it's opening the doors to sort of, socially sanctioned quasi-supernatural experiences. Oh, God, 100 years from now, if we've got Christians running around and Jews running around saying, I experienced this, I experienced that, and like there's a new momentum. Jesus.
Well, I think that, it's one of those things where if you really go deep into it, it's self-undermining. But this is why in the Buddhist tradition, they don't just advocate meditation. And it's part of the danger that I was sort of alluding to when I was talking about how meditation is sort of being taken up by cognitive science and psychoanalysis, and it's being adapted into things like mindfulness-based stress reduction and so on, and mindfulness in the workplace. It's because the Buddhist tradition has always emphasized that you need practice and you need view. That it's dangerous to undertake meditation without the concomitant philosophical exploration and the engagement with the problematics that are pursued in the Buddhist philosophical tradition, because you can wind up anyone can have a mystical experience either spontaneously or via psychedelics or via this or that practice. But the thing is, there's no view from nowhere. The myth of the given is perpetually a problem. And so a person can have an opening that is phenomenologically identical to something that in the Buddhist canon would be, considered a real experience. But when you go and you unpack it, you say, well, that was God. Or, and if you're coming at it from a fundamentalist viewpoint, then, it could serve to reify your false conceptions. However, if you persist in these practices, the things that will be disclosed uh, can, and if you keep going, will undermine uh, the structures and the reifications that you might have had before. But that's if you persist. A lot. Zizek has this criticism of contemporary Buddhism because, he's saying that these business people who undertake it, it's dangerous because they can learn to have equanimity toward uh, the atrocities that they're perpetrating in society. And so they can feel, well, it's all an illusion, and I have equanimity toward everything that's arising in this illusion. And so therefore, I can continue to poison the planet and to take advantage of underpaid workers in the third world because, all of it's not fundamentally real, and I can, cultivate equanimity toward it.
Well, that's sort of what I'm getting at. It seems to be what the horrifying prospect is on the horizon. If you have not just corporate types going at it, but evangelical missionaries or other dogmatist religious types, ouch, you know.
Well, I think that it's not really fundamentalist Christianity or Judaism that's engaged in this sort of thing. We're talking about, mystical Christians, the type of people who would read, for example, Thomas Merton or the Meister Eckhart. And we're talking about mystical Jews, the type of people who would be interested in the Kabbalah and whatnot. And among Muslims, we'll be talking about Sufis and so on. And these sorts are not the troublemaking type. And what they mean by God in general is something much more non-dual and something much more, it's not just transcendent but also immanent. And so it's something much closer to emptiness or the Tao. And I think that the real fundamentalist type are sufficiently, they have a sort of immune system against any foreign bodies of ideas. It's just the deception of the devil. And they're not about to undertake these techniques any more than they're about to start swallowing LSD in large numbers.
Well, that's what I was asking about, because if the mainstream, of the fundamentalist Christian groups or Judaism and so on, if they start approaching meditation and or Buddhism in a larger sense as a means simply to open the door to a certain kind of experience which will, kind of be gas to the flame, then that's a future that is horrible to contemplate. But if it's simply, sort of cosmopolitan types who are, accustomed to pluralism in their worldview and able to entertain this and that, if they're able to go to a sushi restaurant one night and the Tex-Mex restaurant the next, then, there won't be much harm to that. But the so-called mindfulness training that's going on, and not only among the corporate types, but among soldiers as well. How do we deal with your PTSD, Sergeant? Um, how can we make you a better soldier? Well, an hour a day of focusing on your thoughts and directing your energies and so on will whip you into shape.
Sure.
So that's an added bonus to what's going on.
Yeah, these are
That's
very
to be
real.
expected.
These are very real dangers. But I think that that's why I think it's a good sign that there are conferences like Buddhist Geeks, and there are publications like Philosophy East and West, where they'll compare Derrida and Nagarjuna, or whatever, and there is a discourse happening. Um, and there is a sort of, I don't know if I should call it a culture war, but there positionings are taking place. There are people who are resisting the reduction of meditation to mindfulness or Buddhism to meditation, and who are seeing this take place and sort of putting their voices out there about how meditation was always concentrate. It was always a threefold training. There's ethics, there's concentration, and there's insight. And one practice without the other is going to lead to very distorted results.